Close your eyes. Imagine a city on a cliff top, not far from where the mountains of what is now northern Syria meet the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In a time more than 3,000 years ago, there was a city called Ugarit. It was a city of traders and craftspeople and priests and kings, a city where the great powers of the Bronze Age world, Egypt and the Hittites, the kingdoms of Mesopotamia and the rising peoples of the Aegean, converged in commerce and diplomacy and occasional war. Ships from Cyprus and Crete and Egypt anchored in its harbor. Merchants from Babylon and Assyria walked its streets. The smell of cedar wood and salt water and grain and spice moved through its markets on the warm Levantine wind. And in Ugarit there were scribes. The scribes of Ugarit wrote in a remarkable alphabetic cuneiform script, one of the earliest alphabets in the history of human writing, pressed into clay tablets by a stylus made of bone or metal or reed. They wrote letters and contracts and administrative records. They wrote religious rituals and lists of offerings for the gods. And they wrote stories. Extraordinary stories. Stories about the god Baal and his wars with the sea and with death. Stories about the great King Kerat who lost his family to plague and war and begged the gods to restore what had been taken from him. Stories about the wise and righteous Danel who sat at the city gate dispensing justice and who waited, year after year, for the son he did not have. One of those stories was written down by a scribe named Ilamilku, court scribe of King Nikmadu of Ugarit, on 3 clay tablets, sometime around 1400 BC. It is the Epic of Aqhat. The tablets were buried when Ugarit was destroyed around 1200 BC in the catastrophe of the late Bronze Age collapse that swept away almost every palace civilization of the eastern Mediterranean. They lay in the ground for more than 3,000 years. In 1929, French archaeologists excavating a mound near the Syrian coast called Ras Shamra began to find them. What they found changed our understanding of the ancient world. The texts from Ugarit are the closest surviving record of the religion and mythology of ancient Canaan, the culture that produced the Hebrew Bible's immediate predecessor tradition, the culture from which the God of Israel emerged, the culture whose stories shaped the mythology of the entire Western world. And the Epic of Aqhat is one of the greatest of those stories. It is a story about fathers and sons, about the gifts of the gods and the dangers that come with them, about a goddess whose desire becomes an obsession and whose obsession becomes a crime, about a sister whose love for her brother is fiercer than any goddess's anger, about what happens to the land when innocent blood is spilled, and about what it takes to set the world right again. It is also frustratingly incomplete. The 4th tablet, the one that would have told us how the story ended, is missing, lost 3,000 years ago. Whether it was destroyed in the same catastrophe that buried the city, or whether it was simply never found, we do not know. But 3 tablets survive, 3 tablets of extraordinary poetry telling a story of extraordinary depth. Tonight we tell that story. So settle in, let the clay cool in your hands, let the stylus begin to move, and let the ancient world carry you gently to sleep. Chapter 1, the city of Ugarit and the world of the Bronze Age. To understand the Epic of Aqhat, you first need to understand the world that produced it. Ugarit was not a small or peripheral place. It was one of the most important trading cities in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, a hub through which goods and ideas and stories flowed between the great civilizations of the ancient world. The late Bronze Age, roughly 1550 to 1200 BC, was a period of remarkable interconnection. Egypt controlled the Levantine coast, the Hittite Empire dominated Anatolia, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece were at the height of their power, The kingdoms of Cyprus and Crete were maritime powers of significant influence. And Ugarit sat at the intersection of all of these, a city-state that maintained diplomatic relationships with all the great powers simultaneously, that traded with all of them, that absorbed ideas and stories and religious traditions from all of them. The scribes of Ugarit wrote in multiple languages, Ugaritic their own language, Akkadian the international language of diplomacy and trade, Sumerian the ancient prestige language of learning, Egyptian, Hittite. The clay tablet archives of Ugarit are a window into the extraordinary cosmopolitanism of the Bronze Age world. The religion of Ugarit was the religion of Canaan, the religion that the Hebrew Bible would wrestle with for centuries, that the Israelites would define themselves against, that would leave deep traces in the stories and imagery of the Old Testament. The chief god was El, the ancient father god, the creator, the one who presided over the divine assembly. El was old, patriarchal, wise. He sat at the source of the rivers, at the meeting point of the deep waters, and the other gods came to him with their requests and their complaints and their wars. The active, dynamic god, the one who did things, who fought and won and brought the rain, was Baal, the storm god, the rider of clouds, the one who defeated Yamu, the sea god, and established his palace on the sacred mountain, who died and rose again in the cycle of seasons, whose return brought the rains and whose absence brought the drought. And there was Anat, the goddess of war, the maiden warrior, the sister of Baal, his fiercest ally and his most passionate defender. She was called the maiden, but maiden in the sense of independent, untamed, belonging to no one, and she embodied the violent, passionate, uncontrollable aspect of the divine. She was not a comfortable goddess to deal with. In the Baal cycle, the great mythological sequence that forms the other major literary achievement of Ugarit, Anat is described wading through battle with such ferocity that she is knee-deep in blood and ankle-deep in severed hands and heads. She filled the hall with warriors for her pleasure. She fought until she was satisfied. This was the goddess whose desire would set the Epic of Aqhat in motion. And into the world of this mythology, the story begins with a man who has everything except the one thing he wants most. Chapter 2, Danel, and the prayer for a son. His name was Danel. Danel, son of Hanam, the righteous sage, the wise king, the man who sat at the city gate and judged the disputes of his people with a fairness and a wisdom that was spoken of throughout the land. He was a man of exemplary piety. He made the proper offerings. He observed the proper rituals. He honored El and Baal and all the gods of the Ugaritic pantheon with the devotion that they required and that he genuinely felt. He was, by every measure that his society recognized, a good man. He had one sorrow. He had no son. This was not a minor grief in the ancient world. It was an existential one. The son was not merely a personal comfort or a continuation of the family line in the modern sense. The son was the person who would perform the funerary rites when Danel died, who would tend his grave, make the proper offerings, ensure that his spirit was fed and honored in the afterlife. Without a son, Danel's spirit would wander hungry and unhoused in the world of the dead. Without a son, the name of Danel would fade from the world within a generation. The ancient world understood the childless man not merely as unfortunate, but as incomplete, as a person whose story had not yet been properly told, because the story of a man included his son, and without a son there was no continuation, no legacy, no resolution. Danel wanted a son with the full weight of that understanding pressing on him. And so he prayed. The text describes him prostrating himself at the temple, at the sacred precinct where the offerings were made and the gods were served for 7 days. 7 is a sacred number in the mythology of Ugarit, as in so many ancient traditions. It marks the completion of a cycle. 7 days of prayer, 7 days of fasting, 7 days of ritual sacrifice, each sacrifice more costly than the last. He made offerings at dawn and at dusk. He wore out the threshold of the temple with his prostrations. He offered everything he had to give. On the 7th day, something changed. The great storm god Baal heard Danel's prayer. And Baal, the dynamic one, the one who acted while El contemplated, went to the council of the gods and interceded. He approached El, the ancient father, the presiding god, the one whose word was law in the divine assembly, and he made Danel's case. The text preserves his speech. Danel, the man of the healing god, has been performing the correct rituals. He has made the proper offerings. He is a righteous man who serves the gods faithfully. Should he not be blessed? El listened, and El agreed. The blessing was pronounced in language of extraordinary beauty. The ancient Ugaritic poetry moving in parallelisms and repetitions that create a sense of inevitability, of cosmic rightness, of the universe settling back into its proper order. Danel would have a son. Danel received the news with joy that the text captures in his physical response. He unclenched his hands, he laughed, he set his foot on the footstool, he lifted his voice and cried out. He returned home, he prepared a great feast. The Kothar-wa-Hasis, the divine women associated with marriage and childbirth, the skilled ones, the daughters of the crescent moon, came to his house and feasted for 7 days. And when the feast was done, the months of waiting began. And a son was born. He was named Aqhat. Chapter 3, the bow of Kothar-wa-Hasis. Time passes in the epic the way time passes in the most ancient of stories, in great leaps, covering years in a few lines. Aqhat grew. The text does not linger on his childhood. We are told he was a young man, vital, skilled, embodying the ideal of Canaanite youth. The word the text uses for him suggests physical beauty and strength. He was the kind of young man that people noticed, that drew eyes in the market and at the city gate. He was everything a father could have hoped for. And then came the visitor, Kothar-wa-Hasis. His name means skillful and wise, and he was the divine craftsman of the Ugaritic pantheon, the maker of magnificent things, the one who had built Baal's palace on the sacred mountain and fashioned the weapons with which Baal defeated the sea god Yamu. He was the Hephaestus of the Canaanite world, the master of the forge, the architect of the divine, the one whose hands could shape material into something that transcended the material. And he came to Danel's house. In the ancient world, the obligation of hospitality was sacred and binding. A guest who arrived at your door had a claim on your best food, your best wine, your best seat, your best courtesy. The failure to honor a guest was not merely rude but impious. It violated one of the most fundamental obligations that bound human beings to each other and to the divine. Danel honored Kothar-wa-Hasis with the full weight of that obligation. He provided the finest hospitality his household could offer. He fed the divine craftsman, gave him drink, attended to every need. And Kothar-wa-Hasis gave something in return. He gave a bow, not an ordinary bow, a divine bow made in the workshop of the heavenly craftsman, fashioned with skills that no mortal hand could replicate, with a string that breathed like a held promise and a draw that no ordinary arm had the strength to pull. The text describes the bow in terms that make clear its special status. It was not a hunter's tool. It was a sacred object, the kind of thing that existed at the boundary between the human and the divine. that marked the one who possessed it as someone touched by the gods. Danel took the bow, and he placed it in his son's hands. When Danel placed the bow into Aqhat's hands, he was doing more than giving his son a weapon. He was giving him a symbol of his own worthiness, of the divine favor that had been shown to the family of Danel, of the blessing that had come with such difficulty and such prayer and such patience. The bow was the emblem of everything good that had happened, the answer to every prayer, the physical expression of the gods' favor. But it had been made for someone else, and that someone else would soon make herself known. Chapter 4, the feast of the gods and the goddess who desired. There was a feast. The text is not entirely clear on its precise nature. The tablets are damaged at certain points, the poetry moving in fragmentary ways that scholars have worked for decades to reconstruct. But there was a gathering, a divine occasion, and at that gathering the goddess Anat saw Aqhat, and she saw his bow. Let us consider Anat for a moment. She was one of the most important deities in the Ugaritic pantheon, not a peripheral goddess, not a minor spirit, but one of the central divine powers of the Canaanite world. She appears throughout the Baal cycle as Baal's fiercest ally, the one who fights his battles when he cannot fight them himself, who pursues his enemies without mercy, who mourns his death and rages against the god of death until Baal is released. She was called the Maiden, but the Ugaritic word btlt does not mean virginal in the modern sense. It means something closer to independent, unattached, belonging to no man, beholden to no one. A goddess who acted on her own initiative, who made her own decisions, who was not subsumed in the identity of a husband or father. She was also described in the Baal cycle in terms that make clear the violence at the heart of her nature. She was a warrior goddess who delighted in battle, who waded through the blood of her enemies, who kept severed hands and heads as trophies of her victories. She was powerful, she was passionate, she was not accustomed to being denied. And she wanted the bow. Why the ancient text does not give a detailed psychological account. What it gives is the experience of desire, sudden, total, overwhelming. The goddess of war saw a divine weapon in the hands of a mortal youth and wanted it with the kind of want that does not tolerate argument. Perhaps there was something in the nature of the bow made by Kothar-wa-Hasis, the divine craftsman, that made it appropriate for divine ownership rather than mortal. Perhaps Anat simply felt that a weapon of such power should be in divine hands. Perhaps she simply wanted it because she saw it and it was magnificent. Whatever the reason, the want was real, and Anat acted on it as Anat always acted, immediately and directly. As she approached Aqhat, as she offered him gifts, the gifts she offered were extraordinary. She offered silver, not a small amount, enormous quantities. The text implies wealth beyond anything a mortal youth could expect from any human source. As she offered gold, the same extravagance. And then she offered something that no human source could provide. As she offered immortality, life without death, the gift that the Gilgamesh epic tells us that human beings desperately seek and cannot find, the thing that the gods have that mortals do not. Anat told Aqhat that if he would give her the bow, she would ensure that death could not touch him, that he would live as long as the gods lived. It was an extraordinary offer. Aqhat said no. Chapter 5, the refusal. His refusal was not just a refusal. It was an insult. The text preserves his words, or something close to them, working through the fragments that survive, and they are remarkable for their directness and their edge. Aqhat was not merely declining, he was dismissing. He was telling the goddess of war to her divine face that her offer was not worth serious consideration. He told her roughly this: "A bow is a weapon for warriors. Warriors are men. You are a woman, even if you are a goddess. A bow is not a thing that belongs in a woman's hands." He also addressed the immortality offer with a kind of cold practicality. He did not believe her. He told her that immortality was not something that could be granted, that death was the destiny of every mortal, and that no goddess, however powerful, could change that fundamental fact. The promises she was making were not promises she could keep. "You are lying to me," he told her, in the language of ancient Ugaritic poetry. There is much to unpack in Aqhat's response. On one level, he was being foolish with a degree of boldness that is almost admirable. You do not call the goddess of war a liar. You do not tell her that her gender makes her unworthy of a weapon she desires. If you are a mortal young man and the most dangerous deity in the Canaanite pantheon is offering you immortality in exchange for a bow, the rational response is to accept immediately and thank her profusely. Aqhat did not do this. On another level, he was being philosophically serious. His insistence that immortality was not something that could be granted reflects a genuine theological position, the ancient Near Eastern understanding that death was woven into the nature of the mortal world, that the boundary between divine life and human death was absolute and could not be crossed except by the gods themselves. When the Epic of Gilgamesh wrestles with the same question, it arrives at the same answer. The immortality that Utnapishtim possesses is not transferable, and the plant of immortality that Gilgamesh finds is lost before he can use it. Aqhat was, in his way, being wise, but he was delivering wisdom with the arrogance of a young man who has not yet understood that wisdom alone does not protect you from the consequences of how you deliver it. And the part about women and weapons, that was simply a mistake. The greatest warrior deity in the Canaanite pantheon, the one who had waded through battle with the blood of her enemies at her knees, the one who had fought cosmic monsters on behalf of her brother, the one who kept severed heads as trophies. He told her that bows were not for women. The silence that followed this statement must have been extraordinary. Anat's response to the insult was, at first, apparently restrained. The text suggests she left the encounter without immediately acting on her fury. Whether this represents her calculating how to proceed, or whether she simply chose not to dignify his insult with an immediate reaction, the sources do not make entirely clear. What is clear is what she did next. As she went to El, chapter 6, Anat and El, the goddess seeks permission. The divine hierarchy of Ugarit required that even the most powerful gods observe certain protocols. El was the father of the gods, the ultimate authority, the one in whose name the divine assembly made its decisions. Even Baal, who was the active power in the divine world, sought El's sanction for his major actions. Anat was no different. As she went to El, the precise nature of her conversation with El is one of the more difficult parts of the epic to reconstruct. The text is damaged at this point, but scholars have pieced together enough to understand that Anat was seeking, in some form, El's acquiescence in whatever she was planning. This is a remarkable detail. Anat was planning murder. She was going to have Aqhat killed, and she was going to the chief god of the pantheon to seek, if not his blessing, at least his non-interference. El's response, whatever it was precisely, was apparently not a firm refusal. The ancient Near Eastern divine world was not a world of straightforward moral absolutes. The gods had their own interests, their own politics, their own complex relationships with each other. El's authority was real, but it was not unlimited. His children, and Anat was among his children, could act in ways he did not formally sanction if he chose not to actively prevent them. And in this case, he apparently chose not to actively prevent her. The murder of Aqhat would proceed. There is something deeply uncomfortable about this from a moral perspective, and the ancient audience of this epic would have felt that discomfort too. The ancient Near Eastern worldview was not naive about the nature of the gods. The gods could be capricious, unjust, driven by their own desires in ways that caused innocent people to suffer. Aqhat was going to die not because he had done wrong in any cosmic sense. He had been rude, he had been arrogant, he had arguably been foolish in his choice of words. But none of that justified death. And Anat was going to have him killed anyway. And El was going to let it happen. The Epic of Aqhat is, among other things, a story about divine injustice and what mortals do in the face of it. It is a story about what happens when the powers that are supposed to protect the righteous fail to do so. It is a story that the ancient audience would have recognized as a deeply true account of their experience of the divine, not the comfortable fiction of gods who always do right, but the more difficult truth of gods who are powerful and sometimes unfair. Anat left the divine council. She had what she needed. She began to plan. Chapter 7, the plot, YATPAN and the FALCONS. Anat needed an instrument. She could not simply kill Aqhat herself, or perhaps she chose not to, wanting the death to look like something other than divine murder. The epic does not give us her full reasoning. What it gives us is the method she chose. She went to Yatpan. Yatpan was one of her warriors, a member of her divine retinue, the kind of fierce, loyal instrument that a war goddess would surround herself with. He was not a major deity, he was a servant, a hired hand of the divine world specialized in violence, absolutely loyal to Anat. She told him what she needed, and she told him how it would be done. The plan was extraordinary in its strangeness, a piece of divine cunning that reflects the mythological imagination of the ancient Levant. Anat herself would transform into an eagle, a great bird of prey, the kind that circled in the warm thermals above the Syrian landscape and stooped on small creatures with terrifying speed. She would carry Yatpan inside a sack or pouch, suspended from her divine eagle body. She would circle above Aqhat, and at the right moment she would release Yatpan. He would fall on Aqhat from above, from the sky, with the speed and force of a diving eagle, and strike him down before Aqhat had any warning, any chance to defend himself, any possibility of escape. It was the method of a goddess who understood warfare, who knew that surprise and speed and striking from an unexpected angle were the fundamentals of violence. It was also the method of a goddess who was not in any way constrained by the warrior's code that would have required a face-to-face confrontation. She was not going to give him a fair fight. He had insulted her. He had called her unworthy of the bow. He had told her she was lying about immortality. He was going to die from above, from the sky, without warning. But the plan had a flaw that Anat may not have fully thought through. Or perhaps she had thought through it and decided that the death of Aqhat was worth the cost. The bow. The divine bow that had been the cause of all of this, the Kothar-wa-Hasis' magnificent creation, the object that Anat wanted so desperately that she was willing to commit murder to obtain it, was going to be with Aqhat when he died. And in the chaos of the attack, in the falling and the striking and the death, the bow might be destroyed. Anat would have killed Aqhat, and still not have what she wanted. The text suggests she understood this risk. She went ahead anyway. The hunt began. Chapter 8, The Death of Aqhat. Aqhat went hunting. This is the detail that makes the story so painful. He went hunting, the ordinary activity of a young man of his class and his time, the thing that the divine bow was presumably meant for, the thing that young men did in the early morning when the light was good and the game was moving. He had no idea that anything was wrong. The sky was above him. Eagles circled in the thermals as they always did. Anat, transformed, flew in the warm air above him, and inside her divine eagle body, Yatpan waited. The text is fragmentary at this point, one of the most frustrating, damaged sections in the tablets. We cannot read the precise description of the attack. What we can reconstruct is the outline. Anat released Yatpan. He fell on Aqhat, struck him once, twice, 3 times. The text implies multiple blows, the violence described with a kind of terrible economy that is characteristic of ancient Near Eastern poetry at its most intense. Aqhat fell, and the bow, the divine bow that had caused all of this, the bow that Anat had wanted so desperately that she had plotted murder to obtain it, was destroyed in the killing. The details of the attack are fragmentary, but Aqhat is killed, and his bow is destroyed in the process. After Aqhat's death, Anat expresses sorrow, lamenting both the loss of Aqhat and the destruction of the bow. The thing she had murdered to possess had been destroyed in the murder. This moment, the moment when Anat understood what had happened, is one of the most remarkable in the epic, because she grieved. The ancient text preserves her lament. Anat was not simply satisfied with having had her revenge, with having punished the mortal who had insulted her. She looked at what she had done, the dead young man, the destroyed bow, the terrible waste of it, and she felt something that the text renders as genuine mourning. She lamented the bow, she lamented Aqhat. And the text indicates something more disturbing. She understood, or feared, that what she had done would have consequences for the natural world. The death of an innocent young man, killed unjustly by divine power, such a death does not go unremarked by the cosmos. The ancient Near Eastern worldview held that the moral order and the natural order were connected. An act of injustice of this magnitude would disturb the balance. The land would feel it. And it did. Chapter 9, The Grief of Danel. Danel did not know. He was at the city gate, where wise kings and judges sat to hear the cases brought before them, to dispense the justice that held the community together. He was doing what he always did. He was being the righteous man he had always been. The text describes him sitting there in the ordinary performance of his duties, while somewhere in the landscape his son was already dead. The birds knew before he did. Pughat, Aqhat's sister, who will become one of the most important figures in the story, noticed the birds. The ravens and the eagles circling above the house, the birds of prey that circle above death. She brought the news to her father. Danel looked up at the sky. He saw what his daughter had seen, and in the language of ancient Ugaritic poetry, his response is one of the most moving passages in the entire epic. He asked Baal to stop the eagles, to bring them down so that he could examine their bodies, so that he could see in the stomach contents of the birds of prey whether they contained any trace of his son. Because the birds had been circling above where Aqhat died, and the birds had eaten. This is almost unbearable to read 3,000 years later. The father asking the god to bring down the eagles, so he could look inside them for fragments of his son's body. Baal answered, "The eagles were brought down." Danel examined the first and found the fat and bones of his son. He wept. He buried what remained of Aqhat, and then he pronounced a curse. The text preserves the curse in considerable detail, Danel moving through the landscape near the site of Aqhat's death, pronouncing imprecation after imprecation on the land and the cities, and the people in the vicinity of where his son had been killed. For 7 years he said, "Let there be no dew, no rain, no freshness in the fields, no fruit on the vines, no wheat in the threshing floors. Let the land mourn for Aqhat as I mourn for Aqhat." And the land listened. This rejection leads Anat to orchestrate Aqhat's death, resulting in a decline in the land's fertility. The drought that follows is not merely meteorological, it is moral, it is cosmic. The unjust death of the righteous son has disturbed the order of things, and the natural world is expressing that disturbance in the only way it can. The crops failed, the rains did not come. The land that had been fertile and green became dry and brown. Danel mourned for 7 years. 7 years, the same sacred number that had marked his prayer for a son, the same number that had marked the feast when Aqhat was born. Now the number marked the duration of his grief. 7 years of drought, 7 years of sorrow. And all of it, because of a bow and a goddess who could not accept being told no. Chapter 10, Pughat, the sister who took up arms. Now the story turns to the figure who will carry it to its conclusion. Pughat, Aqhat's sister. She had been present throughout the story, the one who noticed the birds circling, the one who brought the terrible news to her father. She had mourned alongside Danel through the 7 years of drought and grief. She had been the careful, attentive daughter, the one who managed the household in the shadow of catastrophe. But Pughat was not going to remain in that shadow. After 7 years of mourning for Aqhat, Pughat discovers that Yatpan was responsible for her brother's death. The text is somewhat fragmentary about exactly how she learns this. What matters is that she learns it. She knows who killed her brother. She knows the name Yatpan, Anat's henchman, the one who fell from the sky and struck Aqhat down in the hunting field. And she decides what to do about it. What she does is one of the most remarkable actions in ancient Near Eastern mythology. She dresses as a warrior. The text describes her preparation with a detail that has fascinated scholars for decades. She put on clothing associated with warriors and with men. She put a sword beneath her robes, hidden, invisible to anyone looking at her. She covered herself with garments that disguised what she was carrying, and perhaps the text implies who she was. And then, in a detail of extraordinary audacity, she disguised herself as Anat. She was going to walk into the camp of the man who had murdered her brother, disguised as the goddess who had ordered the murder. Think about what this required. The courage to confront a killer, the cunning to craft a disguise that would fool him, the patience to play out the deception rather than simply attacking immediately, the self-control to sit across a fire from the man who had killed Aqhat and drink wine with him and wait for the right moment. Pughat had all of these things. She was the tomboy goddess who sets out on a quest of vengeance, not a goddess at all, but a mortal woman who took it upon herself to do what the gods had failed to do, to restore justice in a world where a divine act of injustice had gone unpunished. She set out. Chapter 11, the disguise and the wine. She found him. The text says she sought guidance from a group of nomads, wandering people who moved through the landscape, and who, encountering a woman disguised as a goddess, directed her to Yatpan's camp without realizing who she was or what she intended. Yatpan did not recognize her. Yatpan did not recognize her as Aqhat's sister. He welcomed her into his home, shared wine with her, and unwittingly confessed to the murder of Aqhat. The scene that follows is remarkable in its dramatic tension. Pughat sat with the man who had killed her brother. She accepted the wine he offered. She played her role. She was the disguised goddess, the divine visitor, the honored guest. And Yatpan, warming to the wine and to the company, and to the flattery of what he believed to be divine attention, began to talk. He boasted. He told her, thinking he was telling Anat, thinking he was sharing the story of a great deed with the goddess who had ordered it, what he had done. He described the murder of Aqhat, the falcon disguise, the falling from above, the strikes. He was proud of it. He was sitting across the fire from Aqhat's sister, drinking wine and describing her brother's murder with the casual pride of a man who expected his audience to be impressed. Just as Yatpan's confession falls from his lips and Pughat's revenge is exacted, the clay tablet is broken and the end of the story is lost. The tablet breaks at this exact moment, the most dramatic moment in the entire surviving epic, the moment of Pughat's revenge, the moment when Yatpan realizes who he is actually talking to, the moment of justice, and the clay tablet is damaged beyond reading. What we can reconstruct from later scholarly analysis, and from a brief fragment that some scholars believe may be the conclusion of the story, is that Pughat intoxicated him further before drawing a hidden sword from beneath her garments and decapitating him. The sword that had been hidden beneath her robes throughout the entire encounter, the sword she had dressed in as part of her warrior preparation before setting out. Yatpan died. Pughat killed the man who had killed her brother. And the tablet breaks, and we are left standing on the edge of what might have been the resolution of everything, the restoration of the land, the possible resurrection of Aqhat, the reckoning between Danel and Anat, the final accounting of the divine injustice that had set the story in motion. We do not know what happened next. The fourth tablet is gone. Chapter 12, the missing ending and what it might have been. 3,000 years of silence where the ending should be. The fourth tablet of the Epic of Aqhat, the one that would have told us how the story resolved, was either destroyed in the catastrophe that leveled Ugarit around 1200 BC, or it was never found in the excavations that began in 1929, or it simply has not survived the millennia in any recoverable form. We have 3 tablets of extraordinary poetry. We do not have the ending. Scholars have speculated about what it might have contained, and the speculation is informed by what the epic's themes and patterns suggest must have happened, the internal logic of the story, the patterns of the mythological tradition, the fragments that survive in related texts. The drought. Danel had pronounced a drought on the land surrounding the site of Aqhat's death. That drought had lasted 7 years. The natural order of the ancient Near East did not permit an indefinite drought. The drought was a consequence of injustice, and when the injustice was addressed, the rains would return. Pughat's killing of Yatpan was a form of justice, but it was justice directed at the instrument of the murder, not at its author. Anat was still unpunished. The goddess who had plotted the murder had not been brought to account. Some scholars believe the fourth tablet contained a confrontation between Danel and Anat, the righteous father bringing his case before the divine assembly, demanding the restoration of his son. Some scholars suggest that the epic hints at Aqhat's resurrection, possibly in a symbolic sense, leading to the restoration of fertility and the revival of the land. As the pastures flourished once more, life and prosperity returned to the kingdom. This would make the Epic of Aqhat a story about seasonal death and renewal, the young man who dies at the height of summer and is mourned through the drought, who returns as the rains return, whose resurrection is the resurrection of the land's fertility. The connection to Baal's own mythological cycle, in which the storm god dies and is mourned and